Thank you everyone for joining. The background to this was probably about 2 years ago. I sort of asked David to start taking a look at the um, robotics and automation side, really at the time when cost of living was starting to become an issue. And I thought, there should be some CapEx investment going into that sort of area. It's slightly unusual, and normally I ask the questions, but this time it's going to be the other way around because over the last 6 months I've taken over quite a lot of the work that we've been doing on the robotics side. We had a panel on this at the Edison Growth Conference, three interesting companies presenting their views on the shape of robotics. So David does get exposure through this through the industrial side. And David, maybe you just want to introduce yourself a little bit and the areas that you tend to look at.
Okay, so yeah, I'm an industrials analyst for the last sort of 25 years or so in the city, looking at the UK, or predominantly UK, but a bit of European, North American, electricals, electronics, general industrial, following the trends, seeing, who's in the right positions, who's in the wrong positions. And really, I think over the last few years, we've seen an acceleration of some of these underlying trends. And as Neil says, this sort of automation, which has been sort of bubbling under for years. We've had companies talking about it, but I think it's accelerated because the capabilities have accelerated and the needs for it have also come to the fore.
So, I mean, why don't we make a start? I think the format we're going to try and run with is what we normally do, which is we will have a discussion to try and bring you up the curve in terms of, hopefully to a reasonable level of understanding, to our level of understanding of what's going on in the robotics space, and then try and tackle any questions. So, David, where do you want to start?
Well, I think since you wrote the report, Neil, obviously taking on the great work and improving on it, I'll let you start. Let's peel it back. Let's go back to the fundamentals. And we touched on it briefly. Why, automation, robotics, and why now?
Yeah, I mean, I think my starting point was, there is this pressure on costs, etc., and you can tie that to a general concern around productivity. If you're sitting in the UK, you can't help see the narrative that we have a low productive economy, and that was the starting point in terms of what was driving it. As we started looking at it in more detail, it became apparent that there are other significant drivers. Probably the big one that's been highlighted is just demographics. So there is expectation, partly because of birth rates, particularly in developed economies, but also just the shape of the population, this boomer generation that's retiring, that we're going to have a worker shortage. And by some estimates, that is a 50 million worker shortage that is coming up. Some people have sort of estimated that as by 2030. And I think to address that, robotics is there. There's also a potential skilled labor shortage that sort of accompanies that. And again, robotics is an area that potentially solves that. Other things which I think were less sort of visible, but as you start to look at it, became, I've taken them on as drivers, is one, the fact that actually, the health and safety side of things is growing more cumbersome from a regulation perspective. And actually, if you can replace humans in particularly hazardous or repetitive task areas, there's a benefit that you can see. There's a reduced liability there. There's also this idea that, and perhaps since Trump sort of got in less pronounced, but sustainability continues to be a sort of key driver for a lot of companies. And I think there are gains that you can see from automation and, fast retail. And we might go on to talk about the work GXO is doing in the warehouse space, but just that idea that there's less wastage, less use of materials, if you can do things more efficiently. And then finally, the more broader theme that you're seeing industry digitize, and the creation of smart factories, and so integration of robotics into those smart factories is also driving quite a lot of the investment. So that big picture, trying to solve, demographic and productivity, but there are other benefits that come with it.
Okay, well, to demand one thing, but obviously, to satisfy that demand requires certain sort of capabilities and products. And it's interesting you talk in your note about Jensen Huang, who's obviously the most influential person in
Yeah.
technology these days as the CEO of, I'm not quite sure if NVIDIA is the biggest company in the world anymore, but certainly one of the most important. And he talks about an iPhone moment in robotics. So what's he or what's the world developing that's going to change things?
So yeah, I mean, if you think about the old school robotics, where you imagine a car plant where you've all seen videos of an arm doing a specific task. It was kind of described as mutant brute. These were sort of robots pre-programmed in a very confined space doing a specific task. Basically it's convergence of a number of technologies. So there have been breakthroughs in sensor and actuation technology. And a lot of that is sort of coming through just in this idea of, moving into the physical world, you need visual data, and quite a lot of work has gone into actually improve sensors. Um, the AI focused processing power has improved, and NVIDIA is right at the heart of this in terms of being, the idea that to have the dexterity of a human, you need fast decision making skills, and the processing power is starting to catch up to allow that to happen. The machine learning side of things is really sort of taking off. So it's this idea that you can start to see tasks and learn from them and repeat them and improve on them. And so you're moving effectively from this idea that you've got a robot pre-programmed to do a specific task into robots which, are effectively a free agents. They're starting to operate in a free space, making decisions and using this technology to be much more versatile effectively. And the culmination of this, I think, is this idea of the humanoid robots. You're starting to see things like Optimus out of Tesla, etc. And not at scale right now, but I think that's the direction that we expect things to go. So these general purpose robots have very broad applications. They're not confined to just the factory floor. And I think that that's really why Jensen Huang was already talking about is this combination of AI, taking AI, which is, if you think of in the sort of cognitive space, and moving it into the physical space, which is really exciting and appealing. And there's lots of work that has gone into actually this could have profound changes in the way the world and the world's economy works.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? The fact that we used to think of automation as a factory automation piece of robotics, and yes, they got cleverer and could do more and basically replace people. But that breadth that the new robotics can hopefully deliver in a range of industries, so that really sort of expands the scope. So that really makes me think, so okay, so how big is this opportunity therefore?
Yeah, I mean, there's been various. These are not our estimates. We've looked at the literature out there, and there's a range of different estimates out there, which I think we can run through. Honestly, I mean, I think it's as someone who's looked at technology cycles, I mean, the one thing is that wherever you end up pinning your number to, you're likely to be wrong. What I think is generally accepted is there is likely to be significant change, that the change and the growth is likely to be significant. Sit here forecasting that the humanoid robot market could be worth something in the range of $7 trillion by 2050. Your current baseline is there's about 3.5 million robotic units today, which is 1,000 people per robot, effectively, in terms of the working population. The growth trajectory that is being talked about is that you're probably going to get to 1.3 billion robots by 2035 and 4 billion by 2050. So it gives you an idea of the scale if or that is being anticipated. And it's the fact that it's broad. You know, the reason I think quite a lot of the tech companies are sort of find robotics appealing is that, you know, if you're $1 trillion tech company, your TAM, or your total addressable market, to make a meaningful difference to your business needs to be large. And here is an application which spans lots and lots of market verticals: healthcare, logistics, construction, retail, you know, domestic care, etc. So your total addressable market is significant. And that's why I think you're seeing quite a lot of investment in the space.
Yeah, I mean, the thought of 4 billion by 2050 and the world population of people is about 8 billion or so now. So that
Yeah.
gives you an idea of scale, isn't it? So let's drill down a bit further. Sort of obviously there's still, quite a few hurdles to get over. You know, we've heard things about the driving cars and issues there. So what are the challenges facing these companies?
But I think, you know, typically, I guess if you're looking at it from an investor's perspective, the key risk here is the scaling challenge. And there's a quite a lot of sort of tricky, knotty problems that you have to resolve to really start to see this scale significantly. One is defined, sort of described as at the conference, it was described as the coffee and navigation problem. So it's this idea that, you know, you or me can walk relatively effortlessly through Waterloo Station, balancing a cup of coffee in our hands, etc., and moving through that. That is very complicated for currently in terms of robotics, lots of complex visual and haptic clues, and that is the problem that's being that is being aimed at resolve. There's the sort of real-time dexterity issue. So this idea that the manipulation that we can do with our fingers and thumbs, etc., and the sort of millisecond decision making, and adaptive grip control is hard to replicate. We had both GXO and Box at the conference talking about the software integration challenge. So actually, hardware solutions are can be overcome, and they feel that that's less of an issue. It's integrating, you know, multiple layers of software, which often creates sort of project delays. And then finally, it's this sort of getting to the point of reliability at scale. So, you know, these are robots that are aimed to be producing sort of critical tasks. And you know, if you're processing 200,000 units daily, etc., you need incredibly reliable sort of software so that there's no room for hallucination. So those are all areas which, you know, I don't think have been solved, are being solved, and we're starting to see advances. But those are things that sort of need to be cracked before you actually start to see deployment of this at scale. I'm just going to pause there for a second because a couple of sort of questions sort of have come in, and I will tackle them as we go. So one was, you know, our focus is robotics machinery rather than automation of white collar roles. I mean, generally, I mean, the robotics piece is focusing on, rather than AI and what it can do, it's actually taking this idea of coupling AI and moving it into a physical dimension. So actually the robotics piece is focused on that. But inevitably there are overlaps, and we do sort of talk about, you know, applications for AI in terms of automation. And the other question was this 50 million worker shortage. That is a global number. So by 2030, that's the estimate, that there's going to be a 50 million worker shortage globally rather than just a UK or EU number. So what next, David?
But yeah, so I mean, you just before that, you mentioned some of the complexities about actually converting to using these robotics for companies. So that brings therefore risk. It brings investment, requires investment. So to do that, you know, you're going to have quite high hurdles. I mean, getting to the other end feels great, but you know that section
Yeah.
to get there. So what are the savings and benefits for companies who you think go down this route?
I touched. I mean, so let's tackle the two. I mean, you're right, and I should have pointed this out. One is that one of the barriers is there's a significant capex barrier, so it is expensive to deploy robotics, etc., and there's a capital hurdle. So it's not for everyone. And then ideally, and you'll be familiar that if you're following the industrial sector, if you've got a factory which is operating efficiently and you can replicate that process somewhere else, it completely de-risks everything. So if you've got some kind of homogeneous sort of production process that you can try and replicate, once you've done it once in one place, you can start deploying it somewhere else, etc. That starts to help. So it's finding those sort of opportunities. So the benefits. So I the work that we've done and speaking to people like sort of GXO, firstly is that context really does matter. So the savings have to be done at a sort of project by project basis, and they're really heavily dependent on the sort of specific processes and products involved. So it's not something like that you can apply homogeneously, but generally there is, if once you can deploy robotics in a particular sort of field, there are savings to be had. The savings go beyond the idea of just labor savings. So it's not just about replacing workers. It's improving accuracy. So, in moving from 95% of accuracy using manual workers to 100% accuracy using automation leads to significant waste reduction and inventory management. GXO gave this idea that in one UK customer they went from 3 sites with 1,500 employees to one site with 150 employees to do the same task with automation. So there was considerable saving. There's all the sort of hidden value. So I talked about the idea that there's less wastage. So one of the big challenges for e-commerce and particularly for sort of apparel companies is a lot of their inventory gets discounted, and it goes out. There's a usual problem of you buy clothing product, it arrives at your house, etc. You decide you don't want it, it gets sort of logged back to the warehouse. Currently, it's very hard to sort of reintegrate those SKUs back into the inventory. It is just the processes are very inefficient. Whereas actually with robotics, you're starting to see the wastage and they're being reduced, and they are able to start to integrate that inventory back into, so that the returns effectively back into their inventory at speed, etc. So it's those kind of benefits that you're starting to see, and I think that longer term, it's this idea that if you can create more reliable product more efficiently and more safely, that is likely to be a good thing for the industries involved.
Okay, so we've touched on that and the hardware, but obviously the software side is absolutely critical for
Yeah.
this. And
Yeah.
here, you touched briefly on AI and learning capabilities, and that presumably is absolutely critical for this robotics revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think again, I can't remember whether it was the conference or whether it was one of Jensen Huang's sort of keynotes. One of the things that really stood out, the example that really stood out for me, is this idea that we're at that point where you're doing this sort of machine learning. The example they used is there's a sports example. So you're a professional sportsman, and you're about to go and sort of take a penalty. And what you're trained to do is visualize what you're going to do. And the way they this was described in the robotic space is that the robots are doing this 24/7, right? They are learning all the time, visualizing, etc., through those tasks and so on. So that I think is very, very powerful. The software challenges. Firstly, it's the capital intensity that we talked about. There is significant $10 million type costs to start to put some of these sort of things into place. So you've got to be prepared to put put that kind of scale of capital to work. There's quite a lot of integration complexity. So you might have 6 or 7 different hardware providers which need to integrate into, a particular central warehousing management system that connects to a custom ERP system that then, connects to sort of custom software and transport management, etc. And it's that ability to integrate all of that with the hardware that becomes a challenge. And I think one of the things that so the private company that was at the conference box really stood out for the fact that actually they're to a certain extent agnostic in terms of different software. They've got some very interesting ways of sort of connecting up the hardware to the software. So I think that's something that's going to be sort of resolved. The technical breakthroughs, I think, started to come through just in terms of the chips. NVIDIA are sort of developing. So the Groot N1 dual system, which is the one that's been flagged, is basically sort of inspired around sort of human cognition. So it's fast thinking, allows sort of real time sort of processing, and is starting to allow effectively software to operate at the scale that allows human dexterity. And then, I mean, I think that take all of that, the complexity and the capital, you're starting to build up this sort of competitive moat. So it's an area where actually, generally speaking, we feel that it's going to be the large companies that are going to succeed. However, I would say that there are some great small cap companies out there. So I think we write research on Intelliam, which is operating this space and is looking at AI technology to improve manufacturing processes. I think Origo International, which is this relatively small cap company on AIM, which is automating airport systems. Those are things where I think actually, while the general sort of application I think is going to be for large scale companies, there are some really interesting niche opportunities starting to open up as well.
Yeah, you always find that, don't you, when you get an inflection point in technology, is an opportunity for somebody else to come in and stake a claim. Yeah, so I'm getting slightly concerned now that we are going down the humanoid route, and I'm going to be replaced, and so is everybody else. So, how long have we got left?
Well, I think there's a long, long way still to sort of come. There's quite a lot of hype around this. And I think there is a sort of reality check. So, when you look at the Tesla Optimus, I mean, these are the stage I put them at is that these are sort of commercial pilots rather than at the stage of mass deployment. I'm not expecting to see these. We might be wrong in terms of speed of development, but certainly there's a long way before you start to see the Optimus in households. There are starting to see, there are to give some validity that there is traction. BMW has now started to deploy some humanoid robots through Figure AI, and Amazon's got 6 new warehouse robots in operation over the last 3 years. So you're starting to see some applications of it. The costs have got to drop significantly. So I think generally we're looking at a sort of target of a sort of sub $20,000 per unit cost before you start to see it, being applied on a mass basis. And the typical idea is that it's going to be it's like the SaaS model, but a RaaS model, the robot as a service model. So you pay effectively per use or over a period of time. That is the sort of economic model that's being delayed. So I mean, I generally think that we're at the very early stages of it, but the fact that you're starting to see initial deployments being made means to me that you shouldn't discount that. I don't think we're miles away from it yet. Yeah, it's not like a 20 or 30 year sort of dream. I think, 5, 10 years, you're probably going to start to see some significant advances here.
Okay. So let's drill down to what's really interesting to people here, which is, the winners and losers, and where we go with that. So, you mentioned some larger, some smaller companies. So, how should investors think about positioning their portfolio for this transition?
So, I mean, the first thing is to just come back to, the fact that the expectation is it's going to be a fast-growing market. That, I touched on the sort of 3.5 million units today to, the billions that are expected. And so you're looking at a sort of growth CAGR of, depending on which estimate you look at, 7 to 10% over the next, 10 years. So that is the first thing to note, that you're exposing yourself to something which is above GDP growth. In terms of then how to play it, there's the direct robotic companies. And we can touch on some of these names. There's the enablers. So it's the guys who produce the semiconductors, the chip guys like NVIDIA, the sort of producers of sensors. And then there's the actual beneficiaries. So it's the people who are actually, running logistics businesses, who are running healthcare businesses, where actually you think they're going to benefit from improved productivity. When you're looking at sort of the sort of geographic mix today of who does what well, a lot of the robotic manufacturing supply chain is still in China, so China dominates that. The US is probably a leader in terms of AI models and the sort of technology driving a lot of this. And Europe's got some great companies which are sort of leading industrial applications. So, ABB and Siemens operate in this. I think, David, you look at Renishaw, a smaller company, but these are seen as some of the sort of leaders in terms of how to play. The flip side of it is, okay, what do you need to be aware of? Be aware of, it's high capital intensity. So it almost brought me back to my roots. I used to be a cement analyst, and one of the attractions of the cement industry was to build a cement plant is $100 million, right? It creates these very high barriers to entry. So I think it's finding the people who've got the capacity to deploy them, and the moment they do, it's creating a very big barrier to entry. It's the fact that you're deploying that sort of significant capital through, cycles effectively, and you've got to be able to weather that. And then the other sort of area to sort of keep in mind is just the sort of regulatory side of things, that, like AI, you're probably going to find, increased scrutiny from a regulation, because ultimately you're talking about jobs, people's welfare, etc., and you're deploying robots into sort of contact with humans. It needs to be safe. So there's going to be quite a lot of sort of regulatory oversight over it, and that remains uncertain. And usually regulators are playing catch up with this sort of technology. And ultimately, there's the execution risk. So all the knotty problems I talked about earlier in terms of things that need to be overcome, you've got to be mindful that, not all of those have yet been overcome or need to, are still in the process of being overcome. So that's typically how I think you need to sort of think about it in terms of at a high level. The kind of companies that we've been talking to, I should sort of touch on, companies we've been looking at. So I mentioned GXO. GXO is probably the largest sort of pure play contract logistics provider. If you look at it, I caught my attention because actually, if you looked at what GXO was, it was a logistics company, and it had a very highly unionized sort of workforce working in a very old-fashioned way. But slowly but surely, they've been developing this other side of their business, which is the automation of warehouses. And the thing we like about them is it's asset light. They've got the IP and the technology and the know-how. It's something which they focus on one thing. They're really good at doing it, and they work with some very big clients. Nike, Apple, the supermarkets all starting to work with the likes of GXO. Ocado, it's a sort of the Marmite stock. Some people love it, some people hate it. The bull case for Ocado is that they've got some really interesting um, technology there, which is at the sort of forefront of this particular sort of industry. And over time, if they get it right, then the licensing model starts to work. It becomes a very profitable business. Clearly, there are risks because it takes time to get this deployed. And I think that's some of the sort of frustration around what you're seeing from Ocado. Maybe I get you to talk about a little bit about Renishaw because you talked to them recently that they operate in this area.
Yes, yes. I mean, just going back a little bit, I think it's sort of interesting, isn't it, as to how you think about where to position yourselves. As it's like the miners. Do you go for the operators, or do you go for those who are providing the picks and the shovels?
Yeah,
And I think we've got the same here. Your ex-KO, very much down that end of somebody who's going to really benefit for it, where you definitely need to have the scale because, as you say, the level of investment is going to be quite high. Whereas if you get to the picks and shovels, that's probably where you're going to see the new companies coming in with potentially different business models, like mentioned RAS, and then certainly different technologies. So yeah, Renishaw obviously is a well-established business in measurement, and certainly fits into that area. And certainly one of the things they're talking about is that when you go back to a robotic line that we see on an auto plant or whatever, really, it's doing the same thing again and again. So positionally, it's quite simple. But going forward, that piece of equipment or whatever it might be will want to know exactly, or the brain, the software will need to know exactly where it is geopolitically or positioned. So therefore, the sensors relative to everything else are going to be absolutely critical part of that. And that's where they're trying to put themselves into that bit of the business of the pie. So yeah, that's where they're fitting in.
yeah, and I mean, I touched briefly on some of the smaller cap names that we look at. So Intelliam, Origo International, I think a really interesting place. Origo, basically, I think it's in Malaysia that they've got there. I might have this wrong, but actually, it's Singapore Changi Airport that I think they're working. So they've got this sort of auto dolly, which is basically automating the sort of baggage and cargo handling side of things. And that seems to be going really well. Intelliam, which is an Edison client, it's small cap, a really interesting business. So they go in, they use AI to look at manufacturing processes and find it's the Dave Brailsford example of find lots and lots of small changes and you get profound productivity changes coming through. What I think is interesting about this is this small company is starting to win clients. Just won a US client, which was announced last week. So it's starting to get noticed beyond just domestic shores. It's interesting technology that I think people are finding uses for around the world, and I would keep an eye on that one as well. And in terms of the picks and shovels example, yeah, I mean, look, if you'd looked at it, the clearly it's similar. I did this sort of webinar with Charlie on the mining space sort of a month ago, and I see a very sort of similar analogy to what he was talking about. That actually, what you're probably going to find is the initial plays is going to be in the large cap arena. So you've seen that with Nvidia and the exposure to robotics, etc., and that's where quite a lot of activity takes place. I think you're going to see some of the larger cap names like ABB and Siemens, come into the spotlight for this.
Yeah,
But
fair
then
enough.
over time, what happens is that you start moving down the chain effectively, and that you'll start to see some of the sort of smaller players, and then you'll see the plays in terms of how do I get exposure to this, either through the sort of guys producing the sensors, etc. And the reason I think it happens that way is there's usually a valuation trade-off. Eventually, you feel that I buy the story, but actually it's fully priced in with the sort of larger cap names. And so there's got to be other ways of sort of entering into and getting exposure into this market. You tend to find that investors will focus on exposure through those kind of angles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the big names, as you mentioned, Fanuc or Siemens, it's a nice bit of their business, but it's diluted by some of
All
the
the other things, yeah,
traditional elements, the things that they get up to.
yeah.
Okay, so that's the companies that we've mentioned briefly. When we're sort of looking at other investments that we might have, what should we think that their leaders should be, or chief execs should be talking about to make sure, we know they're on top of what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I said there's a sort of checklist that we're in the sort of process of developing, and I wouldn't say we've completed it, but certainly in terms of guidelines, if you're going to talk to a company and you think actually robotics is coming, how are you preparing for them? Firstly, it's what kind of audit process have they got in terms of looking at their processes. So they need to be identifying sort of labor intensive, repetitive tasks, etc., that they think have the potential for automation. The second is that be very wary of anyone who thinks that they're going to do this themselves. Yeah, I mean, it's really about building the right kind of partnerships with the right kind of technology providers to get execution on this. You need a very careful sort of preparation of infrastructure to make it work. So, if it's changing the workspace to allow sort of the idea that you can get humans collaborating with workforces, you probably want to sort of, and I don't think we're there right now, but there is a big HR element to this, which is, there's got to be a clear workforce strategy in terms of how do you communicate this to the people who work in your business, and to a certain extent, I mean, I think we're seeing this on the AI side, which is, it's been sold as an enabler rather than a replacer, right? And it's the same thing that I think that needs to be sort of communicated by companies. And then ultimately it's the sort of making sure that your data systems are ready, because um, robots are going to generate enormous amounts of data, and if you can use that data, you'll get better and better and better. So they're sort of putting in place the sort of groundwork in terms of what businesses should be thinking about in terms of tackling or preparing themselves for this. And some businesses will be more ready than others.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. I mean, I don't think I open a report from a company at the moment that doesn't say they're using AI, and I trying to get to the bottom as to whether they're just using a little bit of chat GPT to actually produce reports, or whether they're actually using it to enable and really
Yeah.
improve their business. It is quite difficult to get to the bottom of these days. So thanks for that, Neil.
Yeah.
So I know you're a long-term investor. But 5 years is a long time, certainly for you. So where are we going to be on that sort of time horizon? How is this going to develop over that medium term?
I think it's the usual. I would point people to the usual sort of euphoria cycle that you see in most things. So there's going to, as it starts to develop, there's going to be the initial sort of hype around it, and I do think that you'll get companies sort of prices will react probably more than the reality and sort of anticipate that. Um, what you're looking for is actually those businesses which can stand the test of time. So the things I would guide people to, and we perhaps touched on this in terms of what makes interesting investments. That I think look for things that stand out. So I touched on the fact that I really like the sort of asset light model of GXO. Yeah, it's gaining exposure effectively to this segment without necessarily owning the warehouses, etc. And the fact that they're very specialized in what they're doing, I think will mean that they'll stand the test of time. I think it's identifying companies which have got really interesting IP or platforms. So, and again, it's to be debated as to whether Ocado succeeds or not. But it's the thing that I think, the bull in Ocado will see is that they've got this IP effectively in terms of their warehouse automation. It's I think the thing I liked about Renishaw is this idea that they do a small part of a much bigger process, but it's critical and they do it really well. So it's usually that sort of formula for success that it's those companies that tend to sort of have very sticky customers, reliability, etc., and a great opportunity in the market. So I think that you can start to find companies with those kind of attributes and start thinking about those are the things that sort of appeal to gaining some exposure to this segment. And then, I do think there are those sort of niche players. So the reason I mentioned the two small cap companies is that I think, they're doing something very specific in a very sort of niche area, and they're small cap enough, etc., that I think it doesn't take a lot to shift their price significantly.
Well, I'll put those in my portfolio and see what happens in 5 years' time, Neil. So thanks very much for that. Have we got any questions? I think you're in charge of that.
Yeah, so the worker shortage uh, so is only in the West. I mean, the numbers, these are not our numbers. So we have been looking at I guess some industry statistics in terms of what is driving this. So generally it was focused around sort of, I guess, Western economies, and that's where we're going to start to see the boomer generation and the sort of the worker shortages coming out. I think in the case of, you've asked the question, India and China, I think there's different sort of pressures. India, I think less of an issue in terms of an abundant sort of workforce and relatively competitive. China is actually, if you look at what's happening in terms of the tariffs and the migration of sort of workforce. You can hire significantly cheaper in Vietnam than you can in China today. So one of the drivers in terms of China is less about the idea of we don't have enough people. It's much more around the sort of idea of driving down the cost of production. Robots
Quite,
become,
yeah,
sorry.
so it's quite interesting in that there's a lot of talk about AI and robotics and how actually that's going to make people redundant over time, and therefore we're all going to become unemployed. Um, I was listening to it's the Reith lectures that are on BBC, and it's one about 2021, 22, I think it was.
Mhm.
Stuart Russell, who's professor at Berkeley, and it's really interesting him talking about how that's what everybody thought when we had the Industrial Revolution and the agricultural industry was going to be transformed. And look what happened. We just find another way and more things, more productive
Yeah.
things for people to do. So I think it's quite interesting. That's probably
I
where
think
we're
that's right.
going.
That's the general feeling is that it's this idea of, and you can look at my former colleague Rob Murphy sort of used to run this series called Caveman Economics, which was this idea that as you specialize in tasks, it frees people up, it frees people up to do other things. So then you start to do cave paintings and other things. So I think you'll always start to see effectively that, it will allow people to do other things and find sort of more productive uses of their time. So I do subscribe into that. If robotics are becoming more mobile, how are they powered? So, I didn't touch on it, but one of the big areas that people are looking at is the development of battery technology in terms of powering the robots. And that is, they are able to work for longer than they had been previously because of advances in battery technology. We've not spoken about agentic AI. And does robotics coincide with it? Absolutely. So this idea that what you're seeing is this sort of convergence of AI which is operating currently on your laptops effectively, or in sort of in operating systems, and converging that into the physical space. And it's this idea that, if you take, I think there's a really good Morgan Stanley sort of piece that's out there that sort of described it in terms of human evolution, that you sort of saw the sort of advances in sort of changes in DNA and intelligence, etc. But it was only when it was sort of combined in terms of mobility, etc., that you saw, the Cambrian explosion. There's sort of complete change in the sort of the space that we sort of operate in. So I think the thing that's really exciting about it is it's taking all the advances that you're seeing in AI and moving them into a physical dimension, and it's moving it into many, many more applications. So it's agentic AI absolutely couples with with robotics. It's this idea that robots, with the right sensors, with the right kind of learning, etc., are able to make decisions, the right decisions, etc., in the physical space. Um, and I think there are no more questions left. What about SLMs and LLMs? I'm going to defer that. So look, I mean, I won't ignore the question. What I would say is that I would rather get someone from our tech team to probably answer that rather than myself. But I will. What I'll do is I'll get a response back to Pavlina, which you can pass that on. Dan Ridsdale will probably give you a better.
Yeah, sure. That's above my pay grade. I'm not going to attempt to answer that one. So,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right, thank you, Neil. I did have a question. Is there emerging a sort of industry standard industry segmentation model I could look at anywhere that just sort of helps me get my head around this whole emerging industry and the different markets it's supplying into and so on?
No, I mean it's something. There's a lot of work that sort of goes into that. It's the fact that it's got such broad. It's one of our very big challenges when we. So David started looking at this in the industrial side, and then very quickly we sort of saw applications in the healthcare side, and very quickly, as time went on, you're starting to see applications, in many many sort of other areas, etc. So um, we are working on trying to break it down in terms of the sort of different areas and different applications, but there's no standard right now.
No.
I haven't seen it.
No, okay. So I'll keep my eyes out for that. And you mentioned industry standards and so on, or regulations and industry standards. Are there emerging any industry standards here that we need to be aware of? Are people getting together to agree how software is developed in these robots so you can plug and play and the usual stuff that everybody expects things to be totally flexible, so one robot can work in 10 different
No.
use cases and all that stuff? Is that likely to be the future, or is it always going to be specialist robots stuck to a limited range of tasks?
I think the idea is that you would like to get generalist robots. This idea of mobile robots being able to do multiple sort of tasks, etc., is there. I think I haven't. I mean, I might be wrong because there might be things that are being developed, but I've not seen anything that says this is the code of. What you are seeing is quite a lot of focus in terms of whatever it's being developed for. It's safe and reliable first and foremost. So quite a lot of work is going into, if you're going to, you can imagine the sort of PR disasters of humanoid robot causing an accident or something like that. So quite a lot of work is going into just a checking of if you're going to deploy one of these in your house, it's safe. If you're going to deploy one of these in medical applications, it's safe. And it tends to be in those sort of specific use cases over time. The thing I opened up with at the growth conference, if you're there, was this idea that we're at that point where we're trying to make the breakthrough, right? I sort of articulated the bull case for there's lots of bears for Tesla, which focus on the fact that they've got declining car sales. But the bull case for Tesla is they've probably got a leading position in visual data. So these autonomous vehicles, etc., going out there, picking up data, etc., and that all of that being processed. They've got Starlink satellite systems effectively there. They've got a lot of moats effectively developing there, and the point being that the argument that's being saying that people are making is that the car is for robotics what the book was for Amazon, right? So you can crack that one market and get it right, as Amazon did, and suddenly you start to flood lots and lots of other markets. If you can crack the car and you get that right, there is a mass of applications that you can really start to put this through on. In particular, military applications, this idea that, drones are going to be the future, etc., that they're controlled through the Starlink satellite system effectively is what is leading to, okay, we can see quite a big addressable market if you can crack some of the challenges.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Neil. And thank you, David. I don't think no more questions have come in, so I think we're just about done, which is good because we're just about on time as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And look forward to catching up with you. You think probably in the autumn, with possibly something about healthcare coming up, but we'll.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of thematics being worked up in the healthcare space, and I would we can keep it focused or slightly more general, and be interested. Well, happy to do either, depending on
Okay.
what your
Well, we'll maybe survey our members and see if they've got particular interest in that area or more general approach or whatever. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and nice to see you again, Neil, and for the first time, David. So hope to see you again sometime, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Mike.